Victoria stared at the crumpled paper, tears falling onto the incomprehensible letters. "Translate this correctly, and I'll give you my entire empire," Rodrigo Vizquez said with cruel laughter. What no one expected was that those words would change the life of the most powerful man in the country forever. When Victoria opened her mouth and began to speak, Rodrigo's mocking smile turned to absolute horror. That was only the beginning of the most spectacular downfall the business world had ever witnessed. Rodrigo reclined on his $25,000 black marble throne, gazing down from the 52nd floor as mortals ran through the streets of a city that practically belonged to him. By age 48, he had built a tech empire that crowned him the most influential tycoon on the continent, but also the most ruthless and feared. His office was an altar dedicated to his inflated ego. It had armored glass from floor to ceiling, sculptures that cost more than entire mansions, and a panoramic view that constantly reminded him that he floated above all other human beings. However, it was not his astronomical fortune that fed Rodrigo's twisted soul, but rather the absolute power it gave him to crush and humiliate those he considered inferior. "Mr. Vizquez," his personal assistant's trembling voice came through the platinum intercom. "The specialists have arrived for the challenge. Send them up immediately," he replied with a smile that froze the blood. "It's time for entertainment." For the past 3 weeks, Rodrigo had spread rumors throughout the capital about a challenge that he believed was impossible to solve. He had inherited a mysterious manuscript from his deceased great-grandfather, an ancient text written in a baffling combination of languages that no expert had fully deciphered. The document was ancient and deteriorated, with characters that seemed to merge archaic Hebrew, medieval Latin, Byzantine Greek, and dialects that even the most renowned scholars could not identify. Rodrigo, however, had turned this inheritance into his favorite sport of mass psychological torture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he exclaimed as the 6 most prestigious linguists in the region nervously entered his glass sanctuary. "Welcome to the challenge that will make you instant billionaires or the most humiliated failures in academic history." The specialists exchanged anxious and terrified glances. Among them were Dr. Fernandez, a world authority on Semitic languages, Professor Wang, a master of ancient Eastern dialects, Dr. Petrov, a medieval manuscript specialist, Professor Nakamura, an extinct language expert, Dr. Al-Mansouri, a classical Arabic text translator, and Dr. Schmidt, a dead European language specialist. "Here is the cursed document." Rodrigo waved the yellowed parchments as if they were trash. "If any of you supposed geniuses of human communication can completely translate this text, I will give you my entire technological empire. Everything. We're talking about $800 million. The air in the room became thick and stifling. The academics were speechless at the enormity of the proposal. "But," Rodrigo continued with a smile exuding pure sadism, "when you fail miserably, as I am sure you will, each of you will pay me $2 million for wasting my valuable time. You will also have to publicly confess in all the media that you are talentless charlatans." "Mr. Vizquez," Dr. Fernandez stammered in a broken voice, "that amount is excessive. None of us has—" "Exactly." Rodrigo stood up, slamming his fist on the glass desk angrily. "None of you have $2 million because none of you are worth a penny. But I have 800 million because I am naturally superior to all of you combined." The tension in the room was palpable. The translators exchanged glances of utter horror and deep humiliation. "What happens now?" Rodrigo began to pace around them like a predator stalking defenseless prey. "Don't you feel so confident in your supposed extraordinary abilities anymore? Don't you want to prove how brilliant and intellectual you claim to be?" At that precise moment, the door slid open silently. Victoria Morales, 47, entered discreetly with her cleaning cart. She had worked in that skyscraper for 18 years, always invisible to men like Rodrigo. Her pearl gray uniform was impeccably ironed, despite having started her workday at 4:30 a.m. "Excuse me, sir," Victoria murmured, keeping her head bowed. "I didn't know you had an important meeting. I'll come back later." "No, no, no." Rodrigo stopped her with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Stay here. This is going to be hilarious. Everyone, look, here we have Victoria, our beloved maintenance worker. Victoria, tell these so-called experts what your highest level of education is." Victoria felt the heat of embarrassment rise to her cheeks like burning lava. "Sir, I only completed basic education." "Basic education? Basic education only?" Rodrigo clapped his hands with theatrical sarcasm. "And here we have 6 doctors and university professors who probably can't do what Victoria does perfectly every day: clean my office floor properly." The translators looked down at the marble floor, feeling ashamed, not only because of the humiliation directed at Victoria, but also because they were witnessing how cruelly Rodrigo mistreated her. Suddenly, Rodrigo had an idea that he found absolutely hilarious. "Victoria, come here. I need you to look at something very interesting." Victoria approached slowly, clutching the handle of her cart as if it were her only anchor to reality. "Look closely at this document." Rodrigo held the scroll directly in front of her eyes. "These 6 self-proclaimed geniuses can't translate it, not even partially. Could you do it?" It was a completely rhetorical question, a sadistic joke designed to humiliate Victoria and the other academics present. Victoria looked at the scrolls intently, and something extraordinary flashed across her eyes. For a fleeting moment, unnoticed by anyone except Professor Wang, she seemed to recognize something familiar in the mysterious text. I don't know how to interpret those writings, sir," she replied in a barely audible voice. "Of course you don't." Rodrigo burst into deafening laughter. "A cleaning lady who barely finished basic education. Meanwhile, these so-called internationally renowned university experts can't do it either." He turned to the translators, his voice becoming venomous. "Do you realize the delicious irony? You've been paid fortunes for decades to translate academic documents, yet you can't accomplish something even Victoria can do. She cleans toilets for a living." Victoria clenched her teeth with restrained force. She had endured derogatory comments like these for 18 years, but the brutally dismissive way Rodrigo referred to her work hurt her more deeply than ever before. "But enough fun," Rodrigo said, returning to his marble throne. "Dr. Petrov, you will begin first. Show me exactly why you charge $500 an hour." Dr. Petrov approached the document with visibly trembling hands. For 35 minutes, he desperately tried to decipher the incomprehensible characters, but it was clear that he was fighting an impossible battle. The text seemed to transform between different writing systems in a way that followed no logical pattern known to modern academia. This appears to be a complex amalgamation of several ancient languages, but the syntactic structure— "Time's up," Rodrigo interrupted brutally. "Next victim." One by one, each translator tried valiantly and failed miserably. Some identified isolated words in different languages, but none could produce a coherent, complete translation of the mysterious text. With each successive failure, Rodrigo became exponentially crueler and more ruthless in his destructive comments. "Absolutely pathetic. And I naively thought you had functioning brains. My gardener probably understands more languages than all of you combined." Victoria watched everything from her forgotten corner. With each ruthless insult from Rodrigo, she felt something powerful grow inside her. She was not only outraged by how he treated her personally, but also by how he systematically humiliated people who had clearly dedicated their lives to studying and preserving human knowledge. When the last translator, Dr. Schmidt, failed in her desperate attempt, Rodrigo stood up with his arms outstretched in a gesture of absolute victory. "I knew it all along. You are all complete frauds, professional charlatans who have been stealing people's money for years with your supposed expertise." "Mr. Vasquez, Dr. Nakamura said with dignity, "This document is extraordinarily complex and challenging. It appears to be a unique fusion of multiple linguistic traditions that, pathetic excuses. Rodrigo roared with uncontrolled fury. Just miserable excuses from losers. According to our binding legal agreement, each of you now owes me exactly $2 million. The translators looked at each other in utter panic and despair. None of them had such a large sum of money. What happens now? Can't you speak anymore? Have the self-proclaimed language geniuses been rendered completely mute? At that decisive moment, something inside Victoria broke irreparably. She had spent 18 years being completely invisible and being treated as if she were less than human. She had witnessed Rodrigo humiliate innocent employees, fire people for amusement, and destroy lives as if it were a game. But watching him psychologically torture 6 people who had only come to try their hand at an intellectual challenge was the last straw. "Excuse me, sir." Victoria's voice cut through the tense air like a sharp sword. Rodrigo turned around, completely surprised that the cleaning lady dared interrupt his moment of triumph. "What do you want, Victoria? Are you here to defend these academic failures?" Victoria walked slowly toward the glass desk, her footsteps echoing on the polished marble. When she reached Rodrigo, she looked him straight in the eye without blinking for the first time in 18 years. "Sir," she said with a supernatural calm that surprised everyone present, "the proposal still stands, doesn't it?" Rodrigo blinked, completely confused. "What proposal exactly?" "The one to hand over your entire empire to whoever translates the document correctly." The laughter that erupted from Rodrigo was so loud that it could probably be heard throughout the entire building. "Victoria, my dear, ignorant Victoria. Seriously, you, who clean toilets for a living, think you can do what 6 internationally renowned university professors couldn't." Victoria didn't say a word. She simply held out her hand toward the mysterious document. "This is too delicious." Rodrigo wiped the tears of laughter from his eyes. "Please, please, show us your hidden wisdom, Victoria." With deliberate and confident movements, Victoria took the ancient scrolls. The translators watched her with a complex mixture of genuine compassion and scientific curiosity. It was painful to witness Rodrigo mock this woman so cruelly when she clearly had no idea what she was getting herself into. Victoria studied the document for what felt like an eternity. The silence grew progressively heavier and more uncomfortable. Rodrigo continued to laugh uncontrollably. "What's going on, Victoria? Have you realized that?" But his words were cut off abruptly. Victoria began to speak, and the words that emerged from her mouth caused everyone in the room to freeze like statues. Victoria Morales, the cleaning lady who was supposedly only an elementary school graduate, was reading the document in perfect biblical Hebrew, pronouncing it as only the most learned rabbis in the world could. Rodrigo's laughter instantly froze on his face, transforming into an expression of absolute shock he would never forget. Victoria was just beginning to play her cards. The silence that followed her first words in ancient Hebrew was absolute, and every breath in the office could be heard as if it were thunder. The 6 translators were petrified, their eyes wide as saucers. Meanwhile, Rodrigo's jaw hung open, and his mocking expression had been replaced by shock and terror. Victoria continued reading with supernatural fluency, making it clear that she understood and mastered the language with precision bordering on the impossible. Her pronunciation was perfect, with inflections indicating decades of intensive study and practice. The words in biblical Hebrew flowed from her lips like sacred music, laden with deep meaning and spiritual authority. Dr. Fernandez was the first to react, slowly approaching Victoria as if witnessing a religious miracle. That's Hebrew from the Second Temple period," she murmured, her voice trembling. "That pronunciation is perfect. I've spent 30 years studying it, and I've never heard such fluency." Rodrigo's jaw dropped to the floor. For 18 long years, this woman had been in his office, cleaning his desk and emptying his wastebasket. Never once had she shown any knowledge of a second language. Now she was speaking one of the world's most complex and archaic dialects with the natural fluency of an ancient master. But Victoria didn't stop there for even a second. After finishing the first paragraph in Hebrew without pausing to breathe, she continued with the second paragraph, reading in classical Latin with the same supernatural fluency. Dr. Petrov brought both hands to his chest, clearly moved to tears. "Good heavens," he whispered with absolute reverence. "She's reading Cicero's Latin from the 1st century. It took me 40 years to master that dialect, and she speaks it as if she were born in ancient Rome." Rodrigo felt as if his entire known universe were crumbling. His legs began to shake uncontrollably, and he leaned on his glass desk to keep from collapsing. The woman he had considered disposable, someone so insignificant that he didn't bother to remember her name, was demonstrating a level of knowledge he could never achieve in 10 lifetimes. Victoria continued with the third paragraph, this time speaking in classical Byzantine Greek. The words emerged from her mouth with a hypnotic musicality that caused everyone in the room to draw closer unconsciously, as if drawn by an irresistible magnetic force. Professor Nakamura began to tremble visibly, tears of amazement forming in her eyes. "This is impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's reading 6th century Byzantine Greek. There are fewer than 20 people in the world who can do that with such fluency." Rodrigo felt intense nausea rising in his throat. Every word Victoria uttered was a merciless slap to his inflated ego, an artificial sense of superiority. It challenged everything he had blindly believed about himself and the world around him. How had he been so completely blind? How had he been able to live with someone so extraordinary for 18 years and not notice anything? But Victoria was not yet finished with her devastating demonstration. She read the 4th paragraph in classical 8th century Arabic with a pronunciation that brought tears of pure admiration to Dr. Al-Mansouri's eyes. Her voice took on a special reverence as she spoke the words of this sacred language, as if she understood not only their literal meaning, but also their cultural and spiritual significance. She read the 5th paragraph in classical Mandarin Chinese, the language of ancient philosophers and poets. Rodrigo could clearly see how Victoria perfectly articulated each word. She knew not only the technical pronunciation, but also the cultural and philosophical nuances behind each complex expression. She read the 6th paragraph in what sounded like Vedic Sanskrit, not the basic Sanskrit some scholars superficially study, but an archaic variant that made the words sound like sacred incantations from a lost civilization. With each language Victoria mastered, Rodrigo's humiliation grew exponentially. He realized that he had arrogantly boasted about his higher education in front of employees like Victoria for decades, when in reality she probably knew infinitely more than he did about virtually any academic or intellectual subject. His orderly world of absolute certainties was disintegrating, word by word, language by language, revelation by revelation. When Victoria finished reading the last paragraph of the document, she looked up and stared directly at Rodrigo with an intensity he had never experienced before. For the first time in 18 years, there was no submission in her eyes. Her gaze was no longer evasive, passively accepting her inferior place in the artificial social hierarchy. There was something he had never seen before, a deep ancestral wise intelligence that had been hidden all this time behind the cleaning uniform and forced servile attitude. "Would you like me to translate the full meaning into Spanish, Mr. Resquez?" Victoria asked with a supernatural calm that contrasted dramatically with the trembling that had overtaken everyone present. Rodrigo tried desperately to speak, but only a muffled, pathetic sound emerged from his throat. His face had gone from the deep red of anger to the deathly white of shock. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he could feel cold sweat running down his back, despite the office's perfect air conditioning. Professor Wang approached Victoria with tears streaming down his cheeks, as if she were a living legend. "Ma'am," he said, his voice completely broken with emotion, "how is this humanly possible? Where did you learn all those ancient languages? How can you master dialects that require decades of specialized intensive study? Victoria smiled for the first time that day, but it was a melancholy smile laden with years of silent pain, constant humiliation, and an extraordinary intellect forced to hide behind imposed social invisibility. Professor Wang, she replied in a dignified voice Rodrigo had never heard before. Not everyone who cleans floors was born to clean floors, and not everyone who works in an executive office deserves to be there. Those last words were like a poisoned dagger to Rodrigo's heart. He realized instantly that Victoria wasn't just talking about herself, but was making a direct and devastating comparison to him. Rodrigo finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled and weak. Who are you really? Victoria placed the document on the glass desk with reverential care, as if it were a precious, irreplaceable treasure. Her movements were suddenly different. She no longer had the hunched posture of someone trying to be invisible. She had the completely upright posture of someone who knows her own intrinsic value. I am exactly who you have observed for 18 years, Mr. Resquez. I am Victoria Morales, the woman who cleans your office, empties your trash, polishes your imported shoes, and has silently witnessed every one of your humiliations of innocent employees. The difference is that now you know I'm also someone completely different. That is absolutely impossible. Rodrigo stood up abruptly, his face reddening with frustration and utter confusion. His perfectly ordered world, where social hierarchies made logical sense and money equaled intelligence and social status, was crumbling before his eyes. You're a cleaning lady. You didn't even finish high school. It's impossible. That's true. Victoria nodded calmly, showing no hint of embarrassment about her employment status. I didn't finish high school in this country, but that doesn't mean I haven't studied hard. It doesn't mean I don't have a formal education, and it definitely doesn't mean I'm less intelligent than you. That last sentence was like a devastating bolt of lightning that split the thick air in the office. The 6 translators exchanged looks of utter amazement. Never in their academic careers had they witnessed anyone speak to Rodrigo Vizquez, the most feared corporate tyrant on the continent, in such a manner. Dr. Petrov leaned in closer, clearly fascinated and desperate to understand the truth. Miss Victoria, please, we need to understand. Such fluency in so many ancient languages isn't learned by chance or accident. It requires decades of intensive, specialized study. Access to the necessary texts is only available at the world's best universities. It requires specialized mentors and absolute dedication. Victoria looked out the window at the city stretching endlessly below. Her eyes were lost in memories she had kept buried for years, memories of a completely different life, a time when her intelligence was celebrated, not hidden. Dr. Petrov, she began in a soft yet firm voice. 22 years ago, I was Dr. Victoria Morales of the Pontifical University of Rome. I had doctorates in classical philology and ancient Semitic languages. I spoke 15 modern languages fluently and could read 18 dead or completely obsolete languages. The silence that followed was even deeper and more devastating than before. Rodrigo slumped into his throne as if every bone had been ripped from his body. His mind struggled desperately to process the information and reconcile the image he had of Victoria with this new and completely impossible reality. I was working on an international project to preserve ancient texts, Victoria continued. Her voice took on a different quality, as if she were remembering someone from another life. I was considered one of the best specialists in my field worldwide. I had a beautiful house in the Roman hills, a bright and promising future, and constant invitations to give keynote speeches at the world's top universities. Rodrigo felt as if he had been kicked in the stomach. For 18 years, he had bragged to her about his business contacts, his successful investments, and his supposed intellectual superiority. But it turned out that she had had a more prestigious academic career than anything he had ever achieved. What happened? Whispered Dr. Nakamura, with a mixture of fascination and horror in her voice. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, as if the words she was about to utter caused her physical pain, even after all these years. My husband. He was also a university professor, but he always felt that my academic success overshadowed his. For years, I endured his subtle yet poisonous comments, his constant attempts to minimize my achievements, and his cruel jokes about how I worked too hard to compensate for being just a woman in a traditionally male-dominated field. She paused, her voice breaking slightly under the weight of painful memories. But when I received an offer to head the Department of Classical Languages at Oxford University, when I was offered the most prestigious position in my field worldwide, the office was so quiet that you could hear everyone's individual breathing. One night, I came home early from an international conference and found him in our bed with his PhD student. When I confronted him, he didn't show even a microscopic shred of remorse. He told me that I was too ambitious and that no real man could be with someone who always tried to be smarter than him. He said that it was completely unnatural for a wife to be more successful than her husband. Rodrigo felt something strange and unfamiliar stir in his chest. For the first time in years, it wasn't superiority or contempt. It was something more like discomfort, embarrassment. He wasn't sure, but whatever it was deeply uncomfortable and unsettling. But the sexual betrayal wasn't the worst of it. Victoria continued, her voice growing progressively louder. The worst part was discovering that, for months he had systematically sabotaged my work. He altered my research, sent letters to international colleagues lying about my professional character, and forged documents to make it look like I had plagiarized the work of renowned academics. "My God," murmured Dr. Al-Mansouri, putting a hand to his heart. "When I tried to defend myself, no one believed me. He was highly respected, charismatic, and convincing. He convinced everyone that I was having a nervous breakdown and making up accusations out of pathological jealousy. My reputation was destroyed in weeks. Job offers disappeared instantly. Doors closed one after another. Colleagues who had been my friends for years stopped returning my calls." Victoria looked directly at Rodrigo, and he could see decades of pain, humiliation, and loss accumulated in her eyes. "And when I tried to start over in another country, I discovered I was pregnant." Dr. Ferndez put her hand to her heart. "Did you have a daughter?" "I have," Victoria corrected firmly, and with absolute pride. "Carmen is now 21 years old. She's a pediatric neurologist. She graduated college with highest honors. She's the best and most important thing I've ever done in my life." Rodrigo realized he had been holding his breath throughout the revelation. Victoria's story was like a series of brutal punches to the stomach. For the first time in his adult life, he felt genuinely ashamed of his actions, his arrogance, and everything he stood for as a human being. Victoria continued her story, and every word stabbed deeper into Rodrigo's newly awakened conscience. "So I came here," Victoria said, her voice now possessing a dignity Rodrigo had never noticed before. "I had no documents to verify my education, no references anyone would believe. I had nothing except my desperate need to support my daughter and give her the life she deserved. And for all these years," Professor Wang began, his voice heavy with awe and deep respect, "for all these years, I've cleaned offices for men with a tiny fraction of my education," Victoria replied, looking directly at Rodrigo. "I've listened to their superficial intellectual conversations about subjects I mastered while they were learning to read. I've seen how they treat other employees, how they automatically assume money and intelligence are synonymous, and how they confuse financial success with human superiority." Rodrigo felt every word like a hammer blow to his soul. For years he had boasted to his employees about his business achievements, smart investments, and supposed superior business acumen. Now he realized that Victoria had been there, listening to everything, and knowing that his brilliant insights were basic compared to her knowledge. I have seen, Victoria continued, her voice sharp and cutting, how you treat people as if they were disposable objects, how you humiliate employees for minor mistakes, how you fire people just to demonstrate your power, how you laugh at those you consider inferior. The office was so quiet that the sound of each person's breathing was clearly audible. For 18 years, Victoria continued. Tears filled her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of years, of pent-up anger, finally erupting like a volcano. I have heard you mock the people who work with their hands. I've seen how you treat the secretaries, the janitors, the maintenance workers, as if having service jobs makes them less valuable as human beings. Rodrigo wanted to interrupt her. He desperately wanted to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words because he knew deep down that every accusation Victoria was making was absolutely true and irrefutable. Do you know what it's like to have to pretend ignorance every day? Victoria asked, her voice breaking slightly. Do you know what it's like to hear someone misrepresent a historical concept and have to stay silent because you're not supposed to know anything? Do you know what it's like to see important documents misinterpreted and not be able to help because your job is to clean, not think? Dr. Petrov approached Victoria, clearly moved to tears. Dr. Morales, he said using her actual title for the first time, I can't even begin to imagine the pain you must have felt all these years. The pain wasn't just for me, Victoria replied, wiping away her tears with dignity. The pain was for my daughter, who grew up watching her mother work jobs far below her abilities. It was for every employee I've seen humiliated in this office, knowing I had the knowledge to defend them, but not the social standing to be heard. Rodrigo felt intense nausea. He remembered dozens of incidents over the years when he had humiliated employees in front of Victoria. He had made derogatory comments about uneducated people and boasted about his supposed intellectual superiority. Victoria had witnessed every one of those moments, knowing he was a fraud and that his arrogance had no basis. Why didn't you ever say anything? Rodrigo whispered, finally finding his voice. Why didn't you ever tell me who you really were? Victoria looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of compassion and contempt. Are you seriously asking me that? You who fire employees for contradicting you? You who publicly humiliate anyone who questions your authority? She was right, and Rodrigo knew it. His reputation as a corporate tyrant was well known. Employees had been fired for much less than challenging his worldview. Besides, Victoria continued, what would you have gained by telling him? Would it have changed his behavior, or would he have found a way to use it against you, like your ex-husband did? Dr. Fernandez intervened gently. Dr. Morales, have you ever considered returning to academia? With your skills, surely. With what credentials? Victoria replied with a bitter laugh. With what references? My ex-husband destroyed my reputation so thoroughly that even my colleagues believed I was a liar and a plagiarist. After years away from academia, who would take me seriously? Dr. Al-Mansouri stepped forward, clearly agitated. But Dr. Al-Mansouri, this is a terrible injustice. From what we've seen today, your knowledge is irrefutable. Could we help you? Help you? Victoria interrupted, not with anger, but with deep sadness. Where was that help for the last 18 years? Where was it when I desperately needed a job? Where was it when my daughter asked why mommy had to work jobs that were clearly beneath her? Rodrigo realized that Victoria was absolutely right. Like the business world, academia was a place where connections and perceptions mattered as much as actual knowledge. A middle-aged immigrant woman without the right network would face an uphill battle, no matter how brilliant she was. But the most painful thing, Victoria continued, tears streaming down her cheeks, wasn't the personal humiliation. It was seeing my daughter grow up thinking that this was my natural place in the world. It was hearing other children tease her, saying, "Your mom only knows how to clean." It was seeing her work twice as hard in school, not because she loved learning, but because she was afraid of ending up like me. Those words hit Rodrigo like a devastating punch. He realized that his arrogance and classism had hurt not only Victoria, but also affected an entire generation. Victoria's daughter had grown up watching her brilliant mother be treated as if she were stupid, and it had left scars that would probably last a lifetime. "Does your daughter know?" asked Professor Nakamura gently. "Carmen knows I studied in Italy, but she doesn't know the full details. She doesn't know about my previous academic career. She doesn't know about her father's betrayal. She doesn't know how far I fell," Victoria replied. "I wanted to protect her from that bitterness. I wanted her to grow up believing that she could achieve anything and not fear that someone could take everything away from her, as happened to me." Rodrigo realized that he had been holding his breath throughout Victoria's explanation. His entire world had been turned upside down. For years he had blindly believed that social hierarchies made sense, and that people were in their positions because those positions reflected their true value. Victoria had destroyed that belief completely. "The document I just translated," Victoria said, turning back to the text she had interpreted, "is a 5th century text on the true nature of wisdom and wealth. It talks about how arrogance blinds the powerful and how true enlightenment is often found in the most humble places." She held up the paper and began translating into Spanish, her voice clear and firm. "True wisdom does not dwell in golden palaces, but in humble hearts. Real wealth is not measured by coins, but by the ability to see the dignity in every soul. He who believes himself superior because of his possessions is the poorest of all men, for he has lost the ability to recognize the light in others." Each word was like an arrow aimed directly at Rodrigo's heart. He realized that the document was more than just a linguistic challenge. It was a mirror reflecting exactly what he had become and what he had lost in the process. "True power," Victoria continued, "does not come from the ability to humiliate others, but from the ability to lift them up. When a powerful man discovers he has been blind to the wisdom surrounding him, that is his true awakening or eternal damnation." The room fell silent when Victoria finished speaking. Rodrigo realized that he hadn't just lost a bet. He had lost something much more valuable. He had lost 18 years of opportunity to know one of the most brilliant minds he had ever encountered. He had lost the chance to learn from her and become a better person through her example. Even worse, he had lost himself in the process. He had become the very kind of person the ancient document described. He was someone who was so blinded by his own arrogance that he had lost the ability to see the value in others. Victoria carefully folded the document and placed it on the glass desk. "There you have your complete translation, Mr. Vizquez," she said with a dignity Rodrigo could now clearly see. "I believe you know the terms of the agreement." Rodrigo looked at her, and for the first time in decades, he didn't know what to say. He realized that he owed Victoria Morales more than $800 million. He owed her an apology for 18 years of willful blindness and unnecessary humiliation. He had wasted the presence of an extraordinary mind for 18 years. The scariest part was realizing that some things couldn't be bought with money. Respect and dignity were irreplaceable, and he had just discovered that he had been ruining something precious for 18 years without realizing it. The question now was, what was he going to do about it? 6 months after the day that changed everything, Rodrigo stood in front of the mirror in his former personal office, adjusting his tie for the most significant event of his business career. But it wasn't a meeting with multi-million-dollar investors or the signing of a contract that would multiply his profits exponentially. It was the first international conference on dignity in the workplace and business transformation, an event he had proposed after realizing that, in his decades of leadership, he had never genuinely celebrated the people who made his empire work. The change in Rodrigo was completely visible. He had lost weight, not from stress as in previous years, but because he started walking around the offices daily, talking to employees directly, getting to know their personal stories, and understanding their real challenges. His face no longer displayed the perpetual tension of a man in constant competition with the world. Now there was genuine serenity in his eyes, speaking of someone who had finally found purpose in life. A soft knock on the door brought him out of his deep reflections. "Come in." Victoria entered, and Rodrigo was still surprised every time he saw her in her new reality. She was no longer just the woman who had cleaned his office for 18 years, or the brilliant academic who had emerged on that memorable day. She was something new entirely, a transformational leader who had proven that true authority doesn't come from a title or salary, but from the ability to inspire others to become better versions of themselves. "Ready for the most important night of the year?" Victoria asked with a genuine smile. "More ready than I've ever been for anything in my life," Rodrigo replied with absolute sincerity. Over the past 6 months, they had worked together to implement changes that had not only transformed the company, but also the lives of hundreds of employees. Victoria had been named Director of Human Transformation, and together they created continuing education programs, merit-based promotion systems, and a work environment where each person was valued for their contributions, regardless of their background or position. The results were extraordinary. Productivity increased by 40%, and employee turnover decreased by 80%. Most importantly, they discovered incredible talent that had been hidden for years: cleaning staff with engineering degrees, cafeteria workers with master's degrees in education, and security guards with accounting experience. There was cleaning staff with engineering degrees, cafeteria workers with master's degrees in education, and security guards with accounting experience. "The media is here," Victoria reported. "Reporters from 12 different countries. The story has spread worldwide." "Perfect," Rodrigo smiled. "It's important for other companies to see that this model is ethical and highly profitable." As they walked toward the main auditorium, Rodrigo reflected on their extraordinary journey. He had learned that true wealth is not measured by the size of one's bank account, but by the number of lives one touches positively. He discovered that real leadership meant serving others, not dominating them. Most importantly, he understood that it was never too late to change, to improve, and to become the person you were meant to be. When the doors to the auditorium opened, Rodrigo saw something he would never forget: 1,000 people standing and applauding with tears in their eyes. They were employees he had ignored for years, now successful and empowered. Families who had been transformed by new opportunities. Academics had come to study this model of business transformation. In the front row was a 21-year-old doctor who looked a lot like Victoria. Carmen, Victoria's daughter, could finally be proud of her mother, not only for her brilliance, but also for her courage to change the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodrigo began his speech, his voice clear and firm. "6 months ago, I was a completely different man, rich, powerful, and utterly miserable. I believed that my financial success was evidence of my superiority as a human being. I treated people like disposable resources and confused fear with respect." The auditorium was completely silent, 1,000 people hanging on his every word. Then an extraordinary woman who had worked by my side for 18 years taught me the most important lesson of my life. She taught me that I had been measuring success with completely the wrong metrics. Rodrigo looked over at Victoria, who smiled at him with encouragement and pride. Victoria Morales didn't just translate an old document that day. She translated my soul from the language of arrogance to the language of humanity. In the process, I discovered that true wealth isn't measured by the numbers in a bank account, but by the lives you touch positively, the opportunities you create for others, and the legacy of dignity you leave behind. The ovation that followed lasted a full 10 minutes. Today, Rodrigo continued when the applause died down. I am announcing the creation of the Victoria Morales Foundation for Global Dignity in the Workplace. We will invest $500 million to help companies around the world implement similar models of transformational leadership. More important than any donation, however, Rodrigo knew he had found something that no amount of money could buy: self-respect, real purpose, and the deep satisfaction of knowing he was making the world a better place every day. As Victoria took the microphone for her presentation on the transformative power of seeing dignity in every person, Rodrigo reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment. A cleaning lady had taught the country's most arrogant millionaire that true wealth is not found in what you accumulate, but in what you give. The millionaire learned that real power does not come from the ability to control others, but from inspiring them to reach their highest potential. This lesson had not only changed their lives, but also transformed the way companies around the world treat their employees. In the end, the most powerful story is not about money or business success. It's about the magical moment when we finally see the humanity in those we've made invisible. It's about the extraordinary transformation that happens when we decide that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and treated with dignity. That night, as Rodrigo and Victoria celebrated the event's success and the changes to come, they knew they had been part of something transcending any business achievement. They had proven that it's never too late to change or to be better, and that the most important life lessons often come from the most unexpected places. The cleaning lady had changed the world, one life at a time, one company at a time, one story at a time, and that transformation was just